Thank you for inviting me today. So, I am going to talk everyone through what many know to be a somewhat daunting prospect, navigating the kindergarten process in New York City. Um, the upside of being a New York City parent is we have lots of wonderful schools to choose from. The downside is that it can be complicated. So, what we're going to hope to do today is just shed some light on what's important, what maybe isn't so important. And I'm going to ask everyone if you do have questions, we'll have some time at the end. Just use the chat box. I guess we have chat and Q&A, but either we'll cover it at the end, but we've got a lot to go through because we're going to talk about all the different kinds of schools today. So I will add to Liz's description that I am a parent who has raised two children in New York City, and I have done this process in addition to the preschool, the middle school, the high school, and the college. So at every level, and this one stands out because it does take a lot of time and energy. So let's get started. So today we're going to talk about some important information just to shed some light on what can be a fairly opaque process. So we're going to discuss resources, timelines, requirements for different kinds of schools, that's different than testing, and then when you get notification. We're going to lead with private schools that are also sometimes interchangeably called independent schools. I'm going to start with resources. There are some terrific resources out there. I'm a big believer in excellent vetted resources. I don't like getting information, particularly about schools, in a word of mouth way because it's so biased. And this is your child that you're doing the process for. And it's incredibly deeply tender when you're thinking about where your child is going to thrive. And so taking other people's points of view, I think, is not the best way to do it. So what I strongly recommend is you begin research with some vetted sources. So I put a couple of different kinds of advisory services. There's our firm, Smart City Kids. There's the Parents League of New York, and Early Steps, which is an organization geared towards um, increasing diversity, equity, inclusion in independent schools here in New York City. Uh, there are also several websites that might be useful to you. You'll hear me say this word as we talk about independent schools, SAGNY, and it's the Independent School Missions Association of Greater New York. Most, not all, but most of the private schools are members of a SAGNY. They're also mostly members of NICEAs, which is an accrediting organization, as well as NAIS. Um, so I think you should start there when you're doing your research versus a parent website or hearing what your colleague's neighbor did. It's just not a great way to start a school process. In the spring, before you're applying, um, you're going to want to pull together a list of roughly 8 to 10 schools. So if I had a child who was, say, 3 years old right now, but would be 5 by September 2023, I would be doing this right now. So I would look at some of those resources I shared, the ASAGNY website, maybe the Parents League website, maybe go to a school fair and start culling a list of schools that seem interesting. And there are a number of things to think about. There's logistics, which is really important as a parent in New York City. There is, do I want my child in a relatively small nurturing environment? Do I want them in a big school? There are lots of things to think about. If there's an educational pedagogy that's interesting to you to hear about, is that something you want? People will still talk about traditional and progressive schools, but the reality is most of the schools don't really adhere to either of those definitions. They're a little bit old and just kind of from industrial revolution schooling. So we really think much more about best practice. And that means schools where the learners are toggling between sometimes they're coming up with ideas to study, sometimes it's teacher directed, but it's not all or nothing in one way. It's a bit of a hybrid. Um, what you can do over the spring, once you start pulling that list together, go to each school's website, see if they are having spring tours or virtual spring tours. See if there's any sort of information night. If your child is currently enrolled at a preschool, you might want to talk to the preschool director. And now would be a good time just to begin to understand what the process is at each school. So the admissions process, when it opens, when it closes, if you might be considering applying for financial aid, how does that process work? It runs parallel to an admissions process, but it's a little bit different. You also want to investigate if your child will need to do any type of testing. If they do, and I will tell you this, the schools will let you know that in September. When we come into the summer and fall, there are a few things that you can do to make your life easy over the summer. You might want to think about how you're going to talk about your child at these schools. So pulling together some information for essays. Usually they're asking very broad questions like, give us a description of your child. What's something that your family values? Thus, why are you looking at our school? What they want to hear is really about you. They don't want to hear about them. So it's important to remember that when you're describing your child, when you're describing what it is you're looking for in a school, that you really do capture um, what your values are, and you really do capture who your child is. It's not meant to be a list of accomplishments. It's certainly not a resume. They're 4 years old. They don't have resumes, nor should they. But it's just a little bit of a descriptor that goes beyond curious, funny, helpful. If you talk about your child being helpful, give an example. Say, I was in the kitchen making pancakes, and right away she went to get all the measuring cups for me. That's helpful. So just be very authentic in how you pull that language together. Most schools will post their applications online sometime in the middle of August, but some wait till early September. Um, as you begin to have access to the applications, I recommend that you take your time making sure you get it right, but do get them in and do so well in advance of the stated deadline, they say. So if they say application deadline is November 10th, do not wait till November 9th. Get all your applications in by, sometime in the month of September. That will assure you that you have time to get through all the steps in the process. Unfortunately, sometimes these schools will shut down their applications prior to their application deadline because they simply don't have enough time to get through meeting with all the children and families. They hit a hard stop number. So you're going to want to get your applications, start submitting them, and then once you've submitted an application, usually a number of things will come up. So you'll be invited to tour. If you got to do it over the spring, then you won't necessarily have to do it again, but in most cases you can if you want. They may be having some open houses. Open houses can be really helpful in getting to know a school. Most schools want to meet both with parents and with children, and those are separate meetings. And then you'll find out if it's a school requiring some sort of testing. For example, Horace Mann in the Riverdale Country School want children to take something called the FLI, which is First Look Insights. Basically, it's just sort of a pre-academic snapshot of how they're developing. Over the last 2 cycles, many of the other schools used a tool called the T&E assessment, which was teaching and engagement. And it was designed as a stopgap measure when the pandemic hit so that children wouldn't have to do 8 to 10 Zooms with schools. But most schools are moving away from that. And honestly, in April right now, I can't tell you if it will continue next year. but word on the street is a lot of the schools are starting to move away from it. When you go on a tour at a school, even if it's a virtual tour, there's certain things I think it's really important for people to think about. So again, you're going to show up with your tour knowing a little bit about the school. How do you know about the school? Well, you've done your vetted research. Um, During a tour, it's really important to be very actively present. So that doesn't mean that every time someone asks if there's a question you're answering, it just means that you're really taking in the information. And one tool that I recommend often to my clients to help delineate between the various schools is if there's one piece of, say, the lower school, so that's usually kindergarten through fifth grade experience that you're deeply interested in, science, the writing program, physical education, the art studio, it is whatever appeals to you. Just make a note of what they tell you at each school. Here's Browning's take on kindergarten art. Here's Collegiate's take, because when you organize the information that way, it really helps you when you have gone through all these appointments, start to think about what stood out to you, what you thought was meaningful. And you may want to reference it when you have your interview. Tours are generally before the interview, not always, but often. Um, One piece of information is that if you're in a, if you're in a virtual tour, look, do it your own way, but I do recommend if you can wait to scribble down notes until after the tour is over, only because it can get distracting and you can miss something. If you're walking through the physical plan of the school, I always tell people to wait until the tour is over. Then just go pull out your phone and the notes function, or if you have a little notebook, and scribble your thoughts down afterwards, but not during the tour. Um, and I say take a mental snapshot. That goes back to the idea of if it's the art program you're really guided by, if it's the type of math they instruct, you know, look to see that in action on the tour, whether in a kindergarten or older grade classroom, but make the impression in your mind so that when you go in for your interview, when you're writing a note to the school, you can reference it. That's very helpful for you. You're helping yourself. Um, Interviews are really just a way to understand if the prospective family gets who the school is, and for that family to show a little bit about their child and their own family's values. What I mean by that is in New York, a lot of schools have reputations. Many of the schools are more than 100 years old. Um, and there are schools that have these somewhat storied reputations, and people think because they've heard of the school they know the school, and really you don't know a school just because you know the name and a little bit of brief information about it. So that's why I do want everyone to, again, be prepared. You have spent time on the website, you have spent time doing vetted research, again, not just talking at the playground. And maybe even if you do have a preschool director, speaking to them about it. What I do recommend you do is focus most of your research on the lower school years. It's always a little daunting when parents of a 4-year-old come in for their interview and start asking about programs, for 13 and 14-year-olds, because it's a long road between 4 and 14. And so while if you do look for a school that continues all the way through high school, the emphasis should not be on high school when you're interviewing for kindergarten. Sometimes people say, is there a wrong question that I can ask in an interview? And yeah, there are definitely wrong questions. And an example would be, it's just like a job interview, but in some respects, but an example of a wrong question is, don't go to a kindergarten interview and start grilling the admissions person about the college placement. You are 13 plus years away from that. And that should not be top of mind, even though for many people that is the value proposition of private school. And I understand that. There are many on ramps. It's not just kindergarten. Some families do public until middle school or even high school. And so I think that when they're looking to build a kindergarten class, they want to know who your child is now and hope that the values that your family may have will align with the schools. Um, so you want to be specific. Again, why do you like a school? Why do you want your child to learn a certain way? You can talk about that. And that being really thoughtful about how you describe your child. Again, it's not just a series of adjectives. It is almost, there's an old writer's adage, which is, show me, don't tell me. So it's use the narrative to tell a little story about who they are if you're talking about their curiosity, um, or their helpfulness or generosity of spirit, or independence. But make sure that you're painting a holistic picture of who they are. And again, don't feel that you need to impress them. You're just telling them who your child is. Um, Children will have some sort of a visit for a kindergarten admission. And this year it was a little hybridized. There were some schools who had children come in, which was actually wonderful. Um, there are, of course, many schools who still use a Zoom or virtual format. I think that there are a few important things to remember. First and foremost, we don't know what it will look like. These visits really start in October. So I can't predict what October 2022 is going to look like. And I think, to be safe, likely it will be some sort of hybridized model. There are a few things that are important. Don't tell your child that they're interviewing for a school. That's very stressful. They don't know what any of those things mean. They've just started the school year at their preschool. So to immediately tell them, we're going to find you a new school, that's a real adult concept, and children don't process time the way we do. So I really recommend that you just keep it really simple, and a couple days before the first one say, oh, you're going to get to do some activities with teachers. um, and you just present it with enthusiasm. Oh, I'm sure, reference their favorite teacher from preschool or daycare. I'm sure it'll be fun, like when you do puzzles with so and so. Just give that as a little bit of information, and just to have them dressed comfortably. So I don't mean pajamas, but I mean they don't need to be really dressed up. In the in-person visits, we all of us who have been admissions directors have seen more hair bows and neckties get thrown off as soon as children come into the room, or brand new shoes that they can't walk in properly. Just comfortable, neat and comfortable, how they would go to school. So that's how you set them up. Be really careful with the ideas of offering them some sort of bribe. Again, I can't tell you how many children have walked in a room and say, my daddy said if I do a good job, I'm getting a new Lego set. It's not worth it. What I think you should just do is go have fun. You're going to do activities with the teacher. Some schools do them one-on-one, some do in a group. You will know once you've begun an application process, but just keep it very low key. And your child will do great. Children love school. I wanted to share a little bit about what the private schools look for when they're assessing, and it's a number of different things. It is not strictly a cognitive assessment. There's no one standard assessment they're using, but they're looking at a snapshot of who the child is. So they want to see how they've been developing according to all the primary domains of development. Their fine and gross motor development, their social emotional development, their cognitive development. So they may take them through some activities that involve following multi-step directions, some planning, their working memory. They may, if it's a group visit, they're going to take a look at what their social flexibility looks like. Can they cooperatively play well? Can they regulate their emotions? Can they engage in a group activity? Can they persist if something's hard? How are they able to listen? how are their fine motor skills coming together? And, um, they're going to take a little snapshot of their pre-reading and early numeracy skills, but those typically are not the deciders. So it's the whole picture. They just want to see where the child is in relation to what their school looks like. Language skills are something we hear about a lot. And that's not just a vocabulary, it's not just talking, it's about processing information through language. And so, can a child retell a story? Can a child creatively engage in a back and forth? Can a child, if they hear a story read aloud to them, can they make observations through language? So these are all things they might be looking at. And the best way to get there is just talk to your child a lot. If you do nightly reading with them, ask them questions as you read the book. What page did you like best? What did you think was interesting about this color the illustrator used? Just ask questions because children have lots to say. Written correspondence can be an important part of this process. In prior years, we always recommended that people did handwritten notes. Of course, with COVID, that changed. And so, what I would recommend is just send a thank you note to a school after your tour and interview, just one note. And you can write it to the interviewer. You can mention the person who gave you the tour. Um, and sometimes families like to really express a level of strong interest in a school. In New York, this is colloquially known as a first choice letter or even a love letter. So, a love letter is, we love your school for XYZ reason and would be thrilled to enroll if offered a spot. A first choice letter somehow uses language along the lines of, you are unequivocally our top school, and if offered a placement, we will enroll. So it's just a little more emphatic. Schools are not allowed to ask for either of these things, but they like to know. They like to know level of interest from a family. So if there is a preschool director, they may coordinate with them. And those are notes that if a family decides to send them, don't send them right after your interview. Wait until you've seen all of the schools and you've thought about it. So that's something that you can send in December, I would say. Sometimes we get asked if people should send a recommendation letter if they have a family friend or a colleague who's part of the school. It is very much case by case. Um, I would say if it's somebody who knows your child well and they've offered, then that could be a good fit. Uh, but you don't necessarily need it unless the school specifically asks for it. So I would say decide if you need it. Talk about it with your school director. And then other communication. So, what do I mean by that? Calling the school if there are events, being in regular touch about it, and then, much like a recommendation letter, using contacts. I would be careful about over communicating with schools. Most of them have very small offices and it's a bit frenetic once the family meetings start. So, you know, if you have a question, call, but don't make up a reason to call. There's a bit of a myth out there that the more contact, the better. I've seen it work against families. So my advice here is just be normal. If you have a question, you can call. You don't have to write a thank you note for every event. If there's an open house or a diversity talk or family carnival on the weekend, you need not touch base after every single event. Um, so just bear that in mind. And then again, use of contacts. It's tricky with contacts because sometimes it can be helpful, but in the end, it typically won't move the needle. So I always talk this through with my clients about, what is the person's relationship to the school? Are they an active alum? Are they an active parent? Are they just someone who goes there? Have they been locked horns with the administration over the curriculum in third grade? We don't know these things. So you want to ask questions before you activate people. And then the schools will notify all the schools who are part of a SAGNY in early February. Um, and so typically they'll notify you on a Thursday, the first Thursday of February, and will give you a week to decide what your plans are. And there are three notification outcomes. There's an acceptance, which is wonderful. Congratulations. There's a wait list, and then there is a regret or a decline. And so if you were accepted to your top choice school, fantastic, take the spot. If you're on a wait list, um, we're going to talk about that in a second. And if you were not offered a spot, it's best to just let it go. The schools are not going to give you detailed information as to why, but it's typically just about they believe that the way your child learns probably wouldn't align with how they teach. So they don't want your child to be in a program where they're not going to thrive. And so that's typically what that means. If you're waitlisted, the waitlists do move. Not always, but you can be hopeful about it. And I've seen some magical things happen over the years, but it typically doesn't happen until the end of the cycle. So, if you're on a wait list, again, you can reach out to the school, find out how regularly you can touch base, um, and then, keep gentle but consistent kind of pressure on and listen for their response. Sometimes they'll tell you, hang in there. And sometimes they'll say, we're over enrolled. We don't know what we're going to do. If you're hearing that, there's not going to be a spot most likely. To enroll your child, it's typically all electronic. You'll sign a contract and you will submit a non-refundable enrollment deposit. So make sure that you read all the information. Most schools have a date after which you're responsible for the full tuition amount. So it's an exit clause for, more or less. Just read it. Read the whole contract. Be clear on what the dates are. Sometimes we have families who are navigating multiple processes. They're looking for their, to get into public school. They're also considering maybe moving out of the city. Whatever it is, if your plans are in flux, then just be sure that you understand the obligation. What they're not going to do is give you a contract extension. So that's not typically a productive conversation. But if you are going to, if you're hoping you get a spot at a public school, then you'll probably walk away from that deposit money and then you send your child to public school happily. So that's a little bit about private school. One thing I did want to point out is that in New York City, our private schools and public schools have different definitions of when a child is ready according to the calendar. So public school, any child who turns 5 before December 31st is eligible to start public school that year. So, I can be a child with a December 30th birthday. I'm going to be basically 4.5 when I start kindergarten, not in private schools. Private schools typically have a birthday cutoff of August 31st, and they adhere to it. Most schools will even start looking at children who are born in the summer as a little bit young. So that's something for you to bear in mind. There are a few private schools who operate on the same calendar as public, but this is just something to know if you have a child who's a summer or fall birthday. So now public schools. Again, big fan of great resources. The DOE's website is very strong, but it's also rather dense. So that's a good place to refer to. I usually like people to start at Inside Schools. It's pretty user friendly as an interface, and I think it's a good place to do some research. It's run by a group of educators. It's highly vetted. It's really good information. There's also a newsletter you can sign up for called Chalkbeat, and you'll get a daily update from Chalkbeat. The DOE has a daily newsletter too called the Morning Bell. So that might be something you want to consider signing up for too. Just keeps you up to date. Unlike private schools, public schools tend to be hazier about dates. So they'll give you information like applications will become available in the fall, but they won't tell you what they mean by the fall. They won't say September or October. They'll just say the fall. And then about a week before they open, they'll say, we're going to open applications next week. So it's good to be kept in the loop if you're going through that process so you don't miss a deadline. You will create something called a My Schools account in the fall. Again, I don't have a specific day for you, but sometime in the month of September, most likely. Um, Over the last 2 years, the DOE has had virtual events. So schools can have virtual open houses, but it would be wonderful to think that you're going to be able to revert back to doing tours at schools. I don't know that you will, but again, just have your preliminary list that you can research these schools right now in the springtime, using Inside Schools and other great resources, and then start going to the individual school websites and just finding out if they're doing any events. They won't typically post that information. They won't do it now for next fall. They'll do it in the fall. And then you're going to submit your My Schools form, otherwise known as application, in the winter. So that's likely January. Then you'll receive placement information and you can complete enrollment in the spring. So this year is April. And you have time. Some people in the public school process are looking at different kinds of schools. So I'm going to talk about those now. I do want to just reiterate, every child who's a resident of the city of New York is eligible for and entitled to a kindergarten seat the year they turn 5. This is just a snapshot of the different districts, just so you can see. So most of us have what's called a zone school. And so to find out your zone school, you can look at Inside Schools, you can type in your address on the DOE website, you can call 311 and they'll tell you what your zone school is. But it toggles to your home address. And once you know what your zone school is, you'll also know what other schools in the district could be interesting to you. And when you're submitting that form in January, you can list up to 12 schools that you might want to send your child to. Oftentimes people ask if this is something they can game, if they should put their top school lower down the list. And I strongly recommend you do not do that. I also strongly recommend you only put schools on the list where you would be glad to have your child enroll. If you can't get to 12, then stop at 6. That's fine. You don't have to put 12 schools. There are a few districts, 3 in the city of New York, that are unzoned. So one in Manhattan, one in the Bronx, one in Brooklyn. And that means that the children in that district have priority at all the district schools. So that's all that means. There's something called admissions priorities. So that means who is eligible and how do we process their information. So typically it's first siblings who reside in the district. Then it may be students, if the school has a UPK, who've attended the pre-K. Then it's within the district. Then it's often they will enroll children for broader diversity. If as a family you move during the application period, you're just going to go directly to the school, the zone school that you moved to, and talk to them, or go talk to the district enrollment office or the family welcome center. There are some programs that are pretty well known, citywide and district gifted and talented programs. Our gifted and talented programs in New York City have really changed over the last couple of years, not the schools themselves, but the process to access them. So what I mean by that is children used to sit for a test in January. And based on the result of that test, we would see if they would be eligible for either citywide or district gifted and talented programs. This has shifted over the last 2 years. There's no longer a testing cycle. There is a process of a recommendation from a preschool, and then it's a lottery system. So it's different than it was, but I just wanted to make mention that there are 5 citywide gifted and talented schools available to children throughout New York City. So there are 3 in Manhattan, 1 in Brooklyn, 1 in Queens. The other main shift is that the Department of Education is trying to move away from the concept of gifted and talented and shift to something called Brilliant New York City, Brilliant NYC. So essentially, the theory is that all children should be able to access accelerated learning, and that they shouldn't have to go to a special school for that. So starting fall 2022, this is going to be rolled out. It's going to start relatively small, but apparently, the plan is that it will roll out and be available to all the schools in New York City. We're not there yet. We have a new mayor, these things, and we have a new chancellor. So all these things are interwoven, but this seems to be the plan. There are also some schools where admission is screened. So an example of that is a school called the Special Music School, which this one is in Manhattan. It is associated with the Kaufman Center, which is near Lincoln Center, and it's a school for children with musical talent. Now, how do we know that our 4-year-olds have musical talent? Well, they don't have to have any special abilities when they're 4, but there is a screening. It involves essentially sitting and doing some responsive rhythms and beats, and there are other entry points, but kindergarten can be a really nice entry, and it is a school that continues all the way to 12th grade. Another school that people talk about is Hunter College Elementary School. Up until this year, Hunter College was only available to students in Manhattan, but that changed this year. And now a child from any of the 5 boroughs can apply. There is testing that has to happen for Hunter. And so in the fall, you'll go online, you'll start, and have to do this through Hunter on their website, but you'll start the process. You'll find out where you can get your child tested, and then if they score at a certain level, you'll be invited back to Hunter sometime in the wintertime, usually around January, where your child will do a fairly lengthy testing. We always tell people, don't prep your child because that can disqualify them. There's another kind of school designation from the U.S. Department of Education called a blue ribbon school, and we have 5 of them in New York City. So we have 3 in Manhattan and 2 in Brooklyn. And these are schools that are just doing a really good job. So it's something, if you live, in any of these places and you're looking at schools, that might be something worth noting. When you're looking at the DOE website, my advice to you is this. There is something called the School Quality Snapshot. And I know this looks old, right? 2018-19. Unfortunately, we missed there's a year that we don't have because of COVID. But what you're going to see is, based on surveys, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but you're going to get a snapshot of all this information: student achievement, how is the instruction? Are the teachers collaborative? Is it supportive? What's the leadership like? Is there trust? That's always an important one to look at. Are there good ties between the community and the school? So this is a great place when you pull up a school's page, PS 89, I recommend you look right at the School Quality Snapshot because it's lots of really good information. Now, the one thing that I did want to tell you is, as I said, they call the information through survey. Now, there is a page, and this is just a screenshot, so I'm sorry I can't show you, but it will tell you how many people actually responded to the survey. So that's another interesting input. If only 3 parents responded to the survey, that might not be great information for you, but look at that and see if it's helpful. I think it's a very empowering way to get to know what's going on at a school. And you have good information. You have just general demographic information. The teachers, this one I love. How many teachers would recommend their school to families? That's really the highest endorsement a school could get. Now I'm going to talk about charter schools, which, and I should have mentioned this when I was talking about Hunter College Elementary School. Hunter is almost like the original charter school. It is tuition free, but it is not administered by the Department of Education. It's administered by Hunter College of Education, which is a CUNY. Charter schools are not administered by the Department of Education. Our last mayor, Mayor de Blasio, was not a big fan of charter schools. The mayor before that, Mayor Bloomberg, was. So we've seen a lot of charter schools come to New York City over the last 20 years, and many are co-located. That means housed in the same building as other schools. But charter schools typically have a specific educational philosophy or pedagogy. They will have their own process for enrollment. They may have their own standards for what's a good fit for them. Some are single sex. So it just depends on what the school is basing their mission around. And it's typically a lottery, and most families find out in April. And then I'm going to talk about parochial schools too. So these are Catholic schools. There are a couple good places to look at just what are nearby schools. Catholic schools do charge tuition, but it tends to be significantly less than what a private school charges. So, if you don't like your public options, and you don't feel that there's a strong fit in the charter school options, you might want to consider parochial schools. So what it looks like is typically they want an application in by late fall, end of November. They do some sort of assessment with the child. They'll ask for additional information, and then they let you know. It works more in a rolling way. It's not the same as how the private school process works. They're more, if you want the spot, here's the spot. So this can be a great option for some families, and it's certainly something in New York City. We have a pretty broad network of parochial schools, and it might be worth consideration. So that's it at a very high level. I wanted to, leave some time for questions, and I see we have a couple in the chat. So let me start. If you're waitlisted top choice, how do you manage the 1 week response time if you're accepted to other schools? That's an excellent question. Okay. So my first piece of advice there is to always think about just being a good person and being fair. So if your child has gotten offers, whittle them down. Only hold on to one where you would honestly send your child. You don't need to accrue offers. There's no point in that. Hang in there for your waitlist school, but stay in touch with the school where you have an offer and you'd be glad to send them so that they know, you haven't gone radio silent until noon the day the contract is due. So just be thoughtful. If you were lucky enough to get multiple offers, let the ones go that aren't of interest to you. You don't have to do it that day, but let them go within a day or two so they can move to their wait list. It's the only way wait lists move is when people don't sit there holding on to the offers. So, keep one and be thoughtful and kind, and go to, if they have a revisit event, go to the revisit event, and you can continue to work the wait list at the school that was your top choice. So that's a great question. So do I have resources on scholarships for private and parochial schools? So private schools typically don't have scholarships. What they have is financial aid. So what I would recommend people do is go to a school's website and read about their financial aid program. Also, if you decide to participate in a program like an Early Steps, they will help you with that information. Most parochial schools don't do significant scholarships because their tuition is really low relative to what private schools are, but there may be an opportunity there. You would have to look at the specific school, but what I recommend you do is go to the school's websites and start there. And if you see we're an Early Steps member school, that is something that could potentially be a useful tool, because they're an organization that is just really trying to broaden all iterations of diversity in independent schools. There was a question about if the presentation will be received, and I know it's being recorded, so I think you'll receive that. Okay, here's a question. Would I recommend holding back a boy with a MidSummer Birthday? I thought some private schools didn't allow that. Well, it depends. It really depends on your child, and it really depends on the schools you're targeting. The single-sex schools, meaning the boys' schools, they like an older boy. There are a few schools in the city who really adhere to the August 31st deadline. So Horace Mann is one, Ethical Culture Fieldston is another. But most schools begin to think by May, boys are getting a little young, girls too, for that matter. So I think that that's a good conversation to have with if there's a preschool director to speak with, but it's, you also want to make sure that they have, robust programming for that year if they're just on the cusp of being ready for kindergarten. I've seen families send their child to public school kindergarten for 1 year and then apply to private schools. So, it's personal, and I think you would need more information. There's not a hard and fast rule, but most private schools, with a couple of exceptions here, do think that children with summer birthdays are starting to be young. So I think we've gone through all the questions. Are there any additional questions anyone has? Okay. Well, I know it seems daunting, and my best advice is start a very simple spreadsheet. Just pull in information about these schools. If you're doing a couple processes, you might want to have a different page, a page for parochial schools, a page for public schools. But again, it's really, really about doing good research, and don't take other people's experiences as gospel for what the school is like. It's so subjective when people are learning about schools, and I think it's really hard to get information from other families in a word of mouth way that is is going to reinforce the decision. I think you're better served by doing research by going to the Parents League has a kindergarten fair actually at the end of April. So that's something that could be interesting for you. You would maybe get to interact with some of the schools there. They like to give you a lot of opportunities to get to know them. Okay, so I had a question about independent schools that do well with special needs children, particularly specifically ADHD. So all of the schools are used to, they all have learning specialists. They all have children with ADHD and other learning differences. Some schools are specifically designed to meet the needs of those learners, and some schools will, factor in things like the furniture moves, there's lots of physical activity. Class periods are designed so that there are never multiple classes in a row where a child is just expected to sit still, that there's movement after each class. So they'll do reading and then they'll do PE, or they'll do drama, or have a recess. um, I think that one of the most important things at this age is understanding what it means in a broader presentation. ADHD is very, very broad labeling, and there are different ways that it manifests in learners. So, again, if your child is in a preschool and you're getting some good feedback from them, I would talk to them a little bit about it. But oftentimes children with ADHD are better served by schools that are a little more nurturing in their approach. And what I mean by that is that they tend to be, play is more involved in the day. They're a little more child-centered. Sometimes slightly smaller schools can be really great for a child like that, but it just really depends. Most children with ADHD, and whether it's impulsive or it's inattentive, or hyperactive or inattentive, what they really need is structure. So you want to look for a school with really clear structures, so they're not always pushing the boundary and they know what to expect. But I think the things to prioritize are movement, clear instruction in the classroom, and probably a good dose of nurture. And none of that necessarily has to come at the sacrifice of a really strong, robust academic experience. Um, so, I think that when a child is, there was a little more information, but just the thing that happens in early childhood, so that's 0 to 5, is that there's a lot that emerges, but we don't know how a child is going to succeed. We can't tell from the 4-year-old who they're going to be as the 7-year-old yet. So what we're really looking to do is create a culture of consistency, and for children who do grapple with whether it's sensory issues or attention issues, give them the toolkit so that they know how to be successful. That's really, really empowering for them. And what we don't want with those children is for them to begin to feel like they're standing out negatively, because typically they're often incredibly bright and really productive members of the classroom. So you just want to make sure that whether it's through activities like occupational therapy or sometimes speech therapy, you just want to make sure that all of that is happening now, because kindergarten's not going to fix it. It's good for children to arrive at kindergarten just knowing a little bit about who they are. So sometimes children who have attention or other issues, if everyone's sitting on a rug, they're better served by a chair than a rug. All kindergarten classrooms in New York City let children do that. Sometimes they need to have something in their hand to fidget with, or to get some sensory feedback. Again, pretty much all classrooms in New York City kindergartens will embrace that. Where schools can struggle sometimes is if there's an impulsive element, and if a child needs a lot of reminders. The child needs a lot of reminders, and again, it's too soon. We won't know that yet. They're growing so much in this stage of life. They'll be better served by a more nurturing school environment. So that's at a high level, and there are some schools specifically designed just for children whose needs may be more than a mainstream classroom can manage, but it doesn't sound like that's what you're asking me. So that's a little bit to what to keep an eye on. But I think good structure, I think clarity of expectations, and lots of physical play. Those are really, really important for children in kindergarten and beyond. Okay, so we have another question. Okay, good. You're doing OT right now. Excellent. 3.5, don't even worry about it. You've got plenty of time. This is something to, we can talk about it when they're 4.5, but it's good. You're on it, and that's the right thing to do. So that's all I have today. Do we have any other questions? Well, I want to thank you all so much for coming. And as I said, I know that the session is being recorded. So if there are any follow-up or you want to go back and look at some of the information, it's certainly going to be available. And, and I'm always happy to do a service call if families have questions or just want to drill down a little bit with something I shared today. So I had it up before, but it's just info@smartcitykids.com will get you to me eventually, and we can certainly hop on a quick call. So I'm going to thank you all for coming, and take good care. And also, don't worry, it's going to be okay. Your children have a long experience ahead of them. And it's, kindergarten does not set the tone for the rest of their educational process. It's just, we want them in a place where they're going to be valued and like going to school. Those are the main things you want out of kindergarten. So thanks all. Take good care.